important to know as a smaller city, we may not be structured in the same way as the larger cities. Well, we aren't. So the police chief reports to the city manager. The city manager reports directly to the city council, and the council sets overall policy for the city and serves in a part-time capacity, while the city manager and the police chief are full-time employees. As we do start, I know we had a lot of people attending for our budget discussion on Monday night, and thank you all for sharing your thoughts. I did want to clarify that there has been a misunderstanding about the recommended budget for the next fiscal year. It does not reduce parks and recreation services. It's just a timing issue in terms of the funding, and housing related funding is actually $9 million. So yesterday there was a blog posted about it, and if this is a particular topic that you are interested in, as we know many of you are, we hope you'll check it out. Additionally, whatever budget we pass in the next couple of weeks is not going to be our final budget. We will certainly be modifying it in the fall, both in light of evolving community needs and resources. And part of what this town hall is helping us kick off is that dialogue about how we need to consider modifying our budget when we come back in the fall. So I'd like to briefly review our format for this evening. In a few minutes, I'm going to ask our police chief, Dan Mulholland, to make a few opening remarks, but most of the evening is going to be dedicated to answering your questions. We received over 150 questions in advance, and we'll ask the chief to address the most common questions. Questions we're not able to address today will be included in a frequently asked questions, and we'll post that all on the city website. You can also type your questions in the question box. I see many of you are already doing that by selecting the Q&A button on your menu bar. The questions are all being recorded. And so again, if we can't get to them tonight, we will incorporate them into an FAQ. We'll take questions until 8:15. And then in addition to the questions that we have already heard, we'll have an additional 10 minutes for public comment. And we will read the comments. If you send a comment in advance, we'll read those first. And then all other comments submitted will be shared with the entire city council. If you'd like to speak under public comment, please raise your hand. Use the raise your hand feature by clicking on the raise hand button or using the shortcut Alt Y on a Windows computer or Option Y on a Mac. If you're joining us by phone, you can push *9. We know there's a lot of passion on this topic, and for myself, for those of you who don't know me, I said this on Monday night, but my background's public health. I started my first job working, serving homeless women and their children. And I've really spent my whole life in nonprofits and social services and community service. So like you, I have a lot of passion about this topic, a lot of passion about mental health, access to health services, access to housing. And I do want to see our city reflect our values in our budget, which is why I'm happy that we're going to be doing some revisions in the fall. But I also want to say this won't be the last time we hear from you on these issues. We know that part of what is going to make this successful is having an ongoing community dialogue. We already have meetings planned with organizers who've reached out to us and provided us with suggestions, and we'll continue to hold those meetings as well as continue to have public forums where we can hear from all of you on a variety of different issues related to this topic. But we do want to respect everyone's time tonight, so we will end at 8:30, and then we'll look forward to talking to you further. So at this moment, I'm going to turn it over to Dan for opening remarks. After his remarks, our public communications manager, Jennifer Yamaguma, will facilitate the Q&A. Thanks again for being here.
Thank you, Mayor Howard and Vice Mayor Mazur. I appreciate this opportunity to speak to the broader Redwood City community. These are very important topics, and I appreciate the fact that this was so quickly put together to give us this opportunity to engage with the community. And I think it's also important that our community members have a better understanding of the service delivery that they receive in Redwood City. Before I begin, I wanted to tell you a little bit about myself. I think it's important for the community to understand the people behind the badge. I've made it a point of talking to our officers and helping them to understand the importance of getting the community to be connected with us in many different ways, and that starts with familiarity. I know you could read about my professional experiences on our website. I'm not going to go there. I want to tell you a little bit about Dan Mulholland, the person, so you get to understand me and know who I am. I was raised locally in the town of Woodside. I attended Redwood City schools, attended Redwood City churches, played sports at Red Morton Park, played basketball on in our armory, attended high school at Woodside High School, went on to CSM, and then on to University of California at Berkeley, which it's really shaped who I am as a person, also helped very much broaden my horizons and helped me to be connected with people very different from me, living in that college environment and being there for so many years. I met and eventually married a Redwood City girl. Our children were born in Sequoia Hospital, and I've dedicated my entire adult life in the service of this community. I started out at 19 years old in a non-sworn position as a community service officer, and that was in 1985, and I continue to serve the city to this day. I mention these things because you might look at me and see a white male in a position of authority over a police department and not fully understand who I am, what I'm about, what some of my experiences are. And I think it's important for you to know that this community, this Redwood City community, is my second home. If you were to ask my wife and family, they might argue that I probably spend more time here than I do in my own home. But in reality, the community of Redwood City is my second family. This department is my second family. So I care very much about the service delivery that we provide to this community. And I care very much about ensuring that you receive the very highest level of public safety service. And it's done professionally with professional individuals that represent the diversity that you see in our community. From my position of where I speak with you tonight, you know, part of me when I initially heard some of the things that were said about this organization, I got very defensive. I wanted to have a bunker mentality where I got my back against the wall and started communicating and speaking and trying to tell all the good things that we've tried for decades to do to build connections with this community. It was admittedly hurtful and difficult to hear. But I knew that in that place in my heart, that was not a place to communicate with this community. There was going to be no communication there or open dialogue. So this exchange has really caused me to kind of stop, reset, and better understand where I need to come from as your police chief. So my pledge to you is I want to listen to you. I want to hear what you have to say. This communication is vitally important to me. And even before I say a word, I need to be in a position where I'm concerned about what you have to say. I need to be compassionate and understand that the community experiences, despite my lifelong connection with this community, for me, it's very different from what many other people have experienced. So I need to embrace that. I need to embrace the fact that that there are members of our community and members of our nation that are hurt because of what has taken place. And that's very different from the pain that I might feel about what happened. I also need to confess, to understand that where I have fallen short as a police chief, or where we maybe have fallen short as an organization, we need to understand that, accept that, and understand that more work needs to be done in order for us to build and restore trust, the trust that the community has in us, but also hold ourselves accountable to make sure that we're maintaining the very highest standards. I understand there's a time for conviction where I got to get up, get off the sidelines, and make sure that whatever the old patterns of behavior that were in place, that if those need to be changed, then the buck stops with me as the chief of police, and I need to have that accountability for that. And then once I get to that place, I understand that that's where the communication starts with me, to better understand the needs of the community and how I can better serve you. That is not something that's going to take place in a written policy. That is not something that is going to take place over one Zoom conference. This is the start of a renewed relationship, I see, that really gets back at the culture of an organization, the culture of a community, and who we are. So with that being said, I wanted to make sure that you all know where I am coming from and who I am. And I appreciate, again, this opportunity to hear you, to better understand your needs and what you want of your police department, because that is what we are. We are a very professional group of individuals that are here to serve you. And as we move forward through this Zoom meeting and more that will come, I look forward to the opportunities to connect with you in person, to get to know who you are at some of our many community outreach and engagement programs, and really listen to your concerns further in person. So with that, I'll stop with my introductory remarks. I will turn it over to Jennifer to run with it from here. Thank you.
Thank you, Chief. The first question is going to go to the mayor, and the question is, I would like to know how the City Council oversees the police department.
Thank you, Jennifer. As Vice Mayor noted, the City Council hires the city manager, and the city manager then hires department heads, so she would hire the police chief. The City Council sets priorities and expectations for the city and serves in a part-time capacity, while the city manager and police chief are full-time employees. City Council evaluates each department's progress toward goals and their accomplishments as the annual budget is considered, and receives feedback on performance regularly from its residents. Thank you for the question.
Thank you, Mayor. Your next question I'm going to field to Vice Mayor. The rally cry to defund the police is being heard nationwide. What, in the opinion of the City Council, does this mean?
Well, I can't speak for the whole council on this one because we haven't had a full discussion about it, but I can tell you for myself, initially I took it as a full defunding of the police, but I think what we've seen is over the years, police have been asked to take on a lot of jobs that they may not have been trained for, including as mental health counselors, as social workers, as outreach workers, a whole variety of different places. And so the way I'm, I've actually read quite a bit on the subject as well. And the way I'm looking at it is, how do we take the money that we have and put the right people in the right place to serve the various needs of our community? And that's why this ongoing community dialogue for me is the important piece, because as a city, we don't actually have a health department. We don't hire mental health workers. We don't have all of the different pieces that larger cities have. So we're going to have to be working with the county to try and make any adjustments that we may want to make as a city, as well as our nonprofit partners. We work really closely with a lot of nonprofit partners, and we're going to need them even more, I think, as we start to reimagine how we serve our community.
Thank you, Vice Mayor. The same question to the city manager. I would like to know, or the rally cry to defund the police is being heard nationwide. What, in the opinion of the city manager, does this mean?
Thank you very much, Jennifer, and good evening to everyone. Thank you for being a part of this. This is, as the mayor noted, our first time doing a virtual town hall. Thanks for your patience as we got started, and it's wonderful to see so many people who are participating tonight. I really appreciate that. So like Vice Mayor Mazur mentioned, I think we have had a very quickly evolving understanding of what the rallying cry means. And I think there's still a lot of ideas coming forward out of our nation as well as locally about what our role means in the community. So what I'm hearing a lot about when I hear about defunding the police are asking for your local elected leaders to take up issues around systemic racism and economic injustice and issues that are related to policing and also far beyond policing. issues around criminal justice reform, which we don't control locally, issues around education, which again, we as a city don't control as the schools are really a subset of the state of California. As well, issues around housing opportunity, where we do actually have some influence and we work hard to try to advance housing opportunities within our community, knowing what a crisis that is. I think these are really important questions, and it's my hope that as difficult as this period is that we're going through as a country, something much better will emerge. I also think there's a lot of learning that's needed. I think I have more to learn. I think many in our organization, city organization, have more to learn. We're not all in the same place in understanding issues or what solutions might look like. I'm really looking forward to that dialogue, and I really appreciate the constructive ways that so many folks are trying to bring these issues forward for us here in Redwood City. Thank you.
Thank you. And lastly, the chief, same question. The rally cry to defund the police is being heard nationwide. What, in the opinion of the chief, does this mean?
Well, of course, I'll defer back eventually with what our council direction will be regarding how our budget will be handled, and the direction that they then provide to the police department will then dictate what we do with the resources that we have. I think it's very important for people to understand that we've done quite a bit to adapt our service delivery model to what our demands now are as an organization. When I started as a police officer more than 3 decades ago, the service delivery I provided at that time was very different than what we provide today or what our officers provide today. There's a considerable amount of social service that's involved in their service delivery of public safety service to our community. So when we look at issues surrounding homelessness, when we look at issues surrounding mental health concerns, when we look at issues surrounding chemical dependencies, if police departments are defunded, who is going to take care of that, or who is going to pick up that ball and provide those services? When the police are called to an event, if somebody calls 911, I see that as a failure somewhere in the process, whether that is in upbringing, in education, a dependency somewhere, an educational failure. By the time the police department gets involved, there are failures along the way in someone's life that has triggered that. Not on all calls for service, but something has occurred somewhere along the line in someone's life that is called the need for the police department to become involved. So I wonder what it will look like, how we will provide that service delivery. I could give information about the number of officers that we have working now and how those numbers are very consistent with the numbers that we had in 2008 and 2009 when we had a population that was 12,000 residents less, yet they're handling 20,000 more calls for service per year than they were in 2008, 2009. So in many ways, our sworn complement has not changed since 2008 or 2009, yet we serve a larger population. We deliver a much different level of service, and we deliver a much different type of service. So I'm very curious to see how we as an organization could then adjust. But again, I would wait for those directions and adjust our service delivery model accordingly, were we to have to experience significant reductions in the number of personnel that we have working for us.
Thank you, Chief. And now we have a number of questions on police policies and the 8 Can't Wait campaign. So I will begin with a few of those questions. The question is, does Redwood City Police Department plan to formally modify the current policies to align with the 8 recommendations from 8 Can't Wait? If not, what are the reasons for not doing so?
Thank you. So I pulled up our website so I can look here, and just so the audience knows, I also have a staff members here that can assist me with additional information, so I don't keep you waiting. But I wanted to walk through each one of those 8 recommendations and help the community better understand where we are as an organization. From a national perspective, if you look at the campaign, those 8 recommendations were broadcast out nationally. And the service delivery in a remote part of the middle of the United States is very different from the type of rules and regulations that govern the police forces in California. A West Coast delivery of law enforcement services very different from other places. California has a very strict set of guidelines that we have to adhere to. So when broadcast out 8 different rules and expect nationally to see how organizations will respond to those and whether or not they need them, many of those things were already in place here in the Redwood City Police Department. Many of these issues have already been addressed and are in place in California. But it's caused us also to do a deep dive in our own policies. And this goes back earlier to where I talked about also looking at where we are as an organization and where we stand with what we need to do to revise our policies. But if you look at, for example, the ban on chokeholds and strangleholds, the Redwood City Police Department does have a policy regarding the use of carotid restraint. It doesn't allow chokeholds or strangleholds. But that is a very difficult issue right now. I'm sorry for the lack of an appropriate term. But our state legislature is looking at this issue. The federal legislature is looking at this. And we have a set of, even though we have a tool in place, and we have a policy that allows us to perform a certain restraint hold, we have to look at whether it truly is a best practice. And that's precisely what's being done right now at the state level. Our certifications are handled by the California Peace Officer Standards and Training. They are doing a deep dive into this hold. I received correspondence right up till today that talks about how this is the application of this hold is being looked at by the state. Not at the legislative level, but at the Peace Officer Standards and Training level. So this is something that we will also closely follow. There's a target return date of a review of this restraint on June 18th. Whether or not that training will continue to be offered at the basic academy level, and myself and other chiefs of police throughout the state are very closely watching this. But as it stands right now, there is a policy in place. It is highly restrictive. It identifies the circumstances under which this hold could be applied, but it doesn't allow for the application of chokeholds or strangleholds. But we are continuing to watch that, and we are reassessing this policy as it stands in our policy manual now, and that could change in the coming days or week. As far as the requirement for de-escalation, that de-escalation is found in several policies currently within the Redwood City Police Department policy manual. But there are also requirements that a de-escalation policy be incorporated in future legislation in 2021. And I'm pleased to say that we're already ahead of the game. We have draft policies in place that we're considering now. So a formal policy could be introduced prior to the state mandated guideline of January 2021. But in addition to that, we have a very high percentage of our officers that have received the training in de-escalation. They've received 40-hour blocks of instruction in crisis intervention techniques as well. Roughly 90% of our police department, 90% of our police officers and sergeants have received this training, and we're ultimately getting to a goal where 100% of our officers have received this training. But it'll become a mandate a little bit later this year. But currently there are de-escalation requirements embedded within our existing policy, and if you go on our website, you can see that. As far as requiring warnings before shooting, again, there are policies in place currently in our use of force policy that talks about giving warnings or verbal commands. As we look at this, we need to make additional changes. We need to modify that policy as it currently stands. We'll go back and look at it and do another deep dive. We feel that it's accurately represented in a point in our policy that talks about the California Penal Code section that governs police officer use of force in 2 particular sections. Those are prominently referenced in our policy. And it is therefore required for officers to issue a warning, and that is represented in our policy. To exhaust all means before shooting, this was a very difficult language that was incorporated with a use of force change that was introduced through the Weber bill. Very specific language was established in that, talking about how the application of lethal force would be objectively reasonable. It's captured within our existing policy of 301.6 regarding the use of firearms. But the language, as far as exhausting all other means, was very, very broad language, and it basically placed police departments and police officers in untenable situations about regarding the appropriate time to use force. Because what does all other means mean? Does that mean an officer didn't have to go to the call or shouldn't have gone to the call? Does it mean the officer should have spoken with one person first instead of another? Does it mean the officer should have approached from one side of the house or the other? It was extremely vague and ambiguous. And it was important for that language to be worked out by our state legislature. And eventually it was. And that came out after AB 392. Where it set that objectively reasonable language. But that was something that was already in place for most of, if not all, of California law enforcement agencies. But that is there. The duty to intervene and stop excessive force by officers. We have language in place that talks about standards of conduct and how officers are required to promptly and fully report any kind of activity that's inappropriate that's taking place by an officer. That might be a violation of policy or a violation of criminal law, and to take reasonable action while they're on duty. But there is another pending Senate bill, that's Senate Bill 230, that will dictate as of January 1, 2021, very specific language regarding an officer's responsibility to intervene and stop excessive force. And we are working on crafting language to meet that guideline established by the state of California. But as it stands now, that exists within our existing policy, and we will craft a future policy to comply with state mandates that become effective on January 1st of 2021. Banning shooting at moving vehicles. Our policy was revised, I believe it was in 2013. That further modified, restricted how we could shoot at a moving vehicle. That's currently covered under policy 301.6.3. Their officers are prohibited from shooting at moving vehicles unless there's some very specific circumstances that are represented, and after they've had the opportunity to position themselves in a position of safety. That language regarding repositioning or looking for another viable option, that didn't appear anywhere in policy prior to 2013 or 2014, but that language now appears. It's extremely restrictive to say you could never shoot at a moving vehicle, because we've seen so many times around the world where vehicles are being used as the weapon, whether it's a person driving a truck through a crowded marketplace in France, or someplace else in our country where that vehicle was used as a weapon. That has to be something that is considered, and to write language that we could never do that is incredibly restrictive. And it's important that we have existing policy that's modified to at least ensure that the officer just can't stand there in front of the car and demand that they move, and if it doesn't, they open fire. That's not the point. The point is to ensure that they find other safe, viable options that require the officer to move. Another portion of the 8 can't wait recommendations required a use of force continuum. That use of force continuum was, that verbiage was something that was in place when I started the police academy in 1987. But you don't see that. That has changed over the years. And it's a force options policy. It's a series of tools and options that are provided to our law enforcement professionals so they can choose the appropriate level of force to utilize based upon the objectively reasonable standards that they're confronted with. And it's based on a very unique set of facts and circumstances that are there. Continuums traditionally required that an effort be made like rungs on a ladder to get to the top of that ladder to work to that point. But that was old language that was removed, and we no longer have use of force continuums. We have force options, and we have a force option simulator that we train to, and the academy trains to that as well. So it's that is language that may be useful in another state or other areas. That is not contemporary language that you will find in California Police Department policy. And then lastly, one of the 8 can't wait recommendations, or the final one, was the requirement for comprehensive reporting each time an officer uses force or threatens to do so. We have that in place. That's codified in policy 301.7.2, reports by peace officers. If an officer uses force in the field, they're immediately required to notify a supervisor. That event is documented, is investigated, and it's documented. And then it's reviewed at administrative level to ensure compliance with department policy. So all of that reporting, that documentation, and that investigation, all of that is represented in existing department policy. So you can see as I've walked through this, these are things that are already in place or are planned as required by statute. But I also acknowledge that this is very dynamic. Things are changing. For example, the carotid restraint policy. This is something that we will continue to watch, and I suspect we will receive very different direction from peace officer standards and training in the coming weeks. And we will comply with the direction that we receive from our governing body and change our policy accordingly. It's also caused us to do a deep dive further into our existing policies and where we see where we could make it easier for an officer to understand and comply with our policy. We'll do that deep dive yet again as we look to see what's next prior to the end of the year, to see where we need to further modify it to take away any questions so there can be no question. I hope this answers your question. Thank you.
Thank you, Chief. Next question. For the policies under revision, for example, the ban on chokeholds, what is the timeline for review and possible modification of the policy? What role does the community have in this process? And if policies are revised, what would be the expected timeline for implementation, for example, training and enforcement?
Well, the community's role is this. This is the important side for us receiving that feedback from the community to hear what our community expectations are. We also, again, receive our certification from the California Peace Officer Standards and Training. That state entity receives its direction from the governor, and the governor has given very clear direction to post to examine that training that is offered at the police academy. I'm also aware that there's pending state legislation that talks about banning the carotid restraint. So I do think we are weeks away from a pivotal change in that requirement, and the police department will act immediately to comply with the direction that we receive. So we have a method in the police department of crafting an internal memorandum that codifies direction that we're giving the police department. We would implement that with a training bulletin explaining what the changes are, and then our policy would be modified accordingly to reflect that change in requirements as directed by the Commission on Peace Officer Standards and Training.
Thank you, Chief. Next question. What policies are being pursued to determine situations where non-lethal methods are used rather than guns, especially when confronting an unarmed suspect or a suspect that is chemically or emotionally unstable?
Yeah, thank you for that. We have, again, we have existing policies in place for both use of firearms and then use of force for something other than deadly force. And that could be anything ranging in that force option from a chemical agent to a taser device to an impact weapon to I mentioned the OC spray, or the chemical spray that the officers would use to voice commands to fix physical restraint with their personal weapons, their hands and feet. So there are those options that are available, but again, the officer's use of those, either that particular personal device, their hands, it could be their mouth or just their physical presence. If an officer uses force, for example, it has to be, again, objectively reasonable and has to fall within those very specific set of circumstances, and be, again, so specific to match that environment, that situation that they are in. So we have policies that govern non-lethal uses of force or non-deadly force, and those are currently present within our policy, and that dictates how non-lethal force could be utilized by our sworn peace officers in the performance of their duty.
Thank you, Chief. Next question. What defined steps are you implementing to demilitarize the police department and focus solely on community policing?
I mentioned in my statement about our service delivery model, and this is the statement that I'm referencing is after Mr. Floyd's death and the organization's stance on that. Our service delivery model is a partnership with the community. We cannot deliver service and tend to the needs of our community without practicing, embracing, and having community policing really at as our core value. Our motto is providing excellent service with integrity and respect. I mentioned how it was emblazoned above our doorway, both as you enter the building and you exit, so to serve as that constant reminder. But that partnership can't be taken for granted. That has to be built through trust. That trust is developed through familiarity, and that's why we have a multitude of programs in place to build that familiarity with our community. If you look at just something as simple as connecting with us on social media or staying connected with the organization through visits while we're out with the community in an informal setting with Coffee with Cops, participation in our Spanish and English language police academies, our youth academies, our national night out, our volunteers and police service program where community members can get involved. That's at the core value of how we deliver service to our community is having that relationship and providing a level of service to our community in partnership with you. As far as demilitarization, I think the question probably very much centers around an armored rescue vehicle that we have in inventory that we acquired a number of years ago, and I'm predicting that there's probably more questions that are related to that. But that's something that we're looking at now. We understand that that vehicle that we received free of charge from the federal government, that vehicle that was once in the military inventory and is now acquired by us, elicits a very very difficult response for members of our community, and we're aware of that, and we're analyzing. We are aware of that impact that vehicle has, and we are looking at appropriate options that we can take as an organization that will still provide a measure of safety that a vehicle like that provides to our community and to our officers, but also fully understand that scares people. That scares members of our community to have that. So we need to do a deep dive look and look at that vehicle and how it can be used and what some of our options are moving forward if we were to turn it back in. But also, that vehicle is also an insurance policy. We all pay for our insurance. We hope we never have to use it. I pray that we don't have to use that vehicle. We have on tactical operations, but we understand the response that elicits from the community. So we are very seriously looking at that, what we can use, but we want to make a thoughtful decision about if that vehicle is returned, what would be the replacement? How would we ensure the safety of our community with something else that's perhaps not a former vehicle that was in a U.S. military inventory?
Next question. What happens when complaints are filed against officers regarding use of force and discrimination, for example, race, gender, LGBTQ, or mentally ill? Are officers required to be retrained? Are officers fired?
Okay, excuse me. We have a series of our policies and procedures that dictate appropriate conduct and how it's demonstrated by our personnel. There are applicable laws, there are applicable city policies, and depending upon the nature of the transgression, there might be relevant federal violations that could come into play. But our complaints are investigated in accordance with our policies and our laws. And the level of corrective action for someone who would be found in violation of those policies, I embrace a model of progressive discipline, and that could range anywhere from, well, the first level of discipline would be a letter of reprimand, but it could lead all the way up to termination of employment. And that is really based upon the findings of that investigation, what the appropriate measure of discipline that should be issued for sustained violation of that policy. There are very strict guidelines that must be followed that are dictated by government code as to how we conduct those investigations. And we follow those procedures through our internal affairs investigations manual that are very clear and deliberate and dictate how we can and cannot conduct those internal investigations. And an officer, say they are found to be in violation of a department policy, very often a pivotal component in that corrective action is ensuring that they undergo the appropriate level of training to ensure that they're in compliance. But also this department will continue to separate police officers and other employee members that don't stand up to or don't attain and achieve those very high standards that we've set for the organization. We have a certain level of expectation of how we carry ourselves and how we conduct ourselves that is much higher than someone in the community. And I, as your chief of police, have very high levels of professionalism of the men and women that work in this organization. And we have had sworn personnel under my leadership that have been on pathways to separate from this organization because of disciplinary reasons or unsatisfactory performance. So depending upon the nature of the violation, we utilize that progressive discipline model to determine the appropriate measure of discipline if a sustained allegation is found.
How can citizens hold officers accountable when they see something being done in uniform that doesn't reflect the commitment they took when they were sworn into office? What actions should we take in the moment? And how can we follow up to ensure officers are given disciplinary action when a behavior warrants that?
So we receive internal complaints, complaints against officers for their conduct or any member of the organization. We have those policies that dictate how they're supposed to perform. We have a mechanism in place for receiving those complaints from members of the community about an officer or an employee's performance. That could be done in the form of an online report. They could come down to the police department and fill out that paperwork in person. Or that complaint could be received over the phone. So we have a mechanism in place for receiving those complaints regarding the performance of our personnel. Members of the community can also ask for supervisors to respond to the scene. They can have a sergeant come out if a sergeant's available or a lieutenant available if they're on duty, depending upon who that supervisor is. They can express themselves about what they saw and explain to the supervisor what they thought was appropriate and report that right at the scene and take that proactive step immediately to report that to a member of the organization. But you could mail in that complaint, you could telephone a complaint, you can lodge it in person by calling a supervisor to do the scene, you can complete it online. Once a citizen or a member of the community files that complaint, there are requirements that we then report back after the end of the complaint with what the outcome, or the end of that investigation, what the outcome of that investigation was. And again, whether that the allegation was sustained or not, but we are not allowed to release the specific, if any discipline came out, we're not allowed to release that very specific information about the level of discipline that may have been received by the police officer. That is not something that we are legally allowed to do. That is restricted by the state, with the exception of certain requirements that were that you would find under mandate from SB 1421 that were required under very certain circumstances, whether that was sustained allegations of dishonesty, sustained allegations of sexual assault, incidents where you have lethal force that was utilized. Those outcomes of those information or those investigations would then be made available. But other lesser violations of policy, that discipline would not be released.
Under what circumstances would you support the creation of an independent oversight board to monitor and review police departments' policies and practices?
Well, we believe we conduct some very thorough and impartial internal investigations and take the appropriate action. And as I mentioned earlier, there are government code sections that dictate the type of action that we can take and how those investigations can be conducted. In some of the more serious cases, I would communicate and have communicated with our city attorney's office. I have communicated with members of our human resources department, and we have a roundtable to see if because of the nature of the allegation, if that investigation should be handed off to an external investigator or a member of the human resources department. Again, it's driven by the nature of the allegation. There's also in the more serious situations, I consult with our district attorney, Mr. Wagstaff, and seek his guidance and his feedback and give him the opportunity, or his staff the opportunity also, depending upon the nature of the allegation, to look into, to conduct an investigation into that. If our city council or my city manager is not satisfied with what we are doing as an organization, and they felt that it was appropriate for there to be some kind of community or outside review of what we do as an organization, then I would defer to our electeds and my city manager to dictate how that will be done, or to tell me how that will be done. But again, I think the process that we have withstands scrutiny. We have oversight internally with a designated captain that is responsible for doing that. And we also have our own policies and procedures that are in place that drive how that investigation is done, and it has to comply with our government code. And I also neglected the fact that we also have a civil grand jury that is in a position to come in and look at what a nature of an allegation and pick up from there. So our civil grand jury can look at our policies, procedures. They can look at what we do as an organization and further drill down and make recommendations to police departments as well. So there are a number of different external bodies outside the police department that can look at what we do as a police department when conducting those internal investigations, and offer feedback and drive the direction of those investigations based upon their position and based upon the nature of the allegation.
What is the average number of citizen complaints an officer in our city has against him or her? How many officers have complaints above the average? And what probation, retraining, or other remediation plans are in place?
Well, we're fortunate at our department that, I mean, every person who's been hired, I was here before them. So I have a very keen understanding of who is working for this organization. And the type of person that they are. And I do sit on these review panels as they are working their way through the entry process to become police officers with this department. So I know who we have working for us, and I've got a very astute management team that assists me in ensuring that our personnel are held to the highest level of performance. If you like, for example, we ran some statistics recently regarding officers in the last 4 years. If you look at a window, maybe a high might be 3 complaints filed against any one officer, 4 complaints filed against an officer, and that would trigger a review by our organization to see what is taking place. We have some of those complaints that are filed against any one person. Some could be withdrawn. They could be pending the results of the investigation. They could be not sustained. But there are any number of outcomes that could come from that filing a complaint against an officer. But probably high might be an officer that have had 4, maybe 5 complaints that have been filed against them in a 4-year period. There are many, many, many officers in this organization that haven't had 1. They have 0. I think probably if you look at an average department wide in a 4-year period, if you were lumping in the entire organization, probably less than 1/4 of a complaint has been filed against an officer in a 4-year period. Very, very small percentage. But we do have mechanisms in place. If we do see a number of complaints being filed against a police officer, because of our size, we have a total strength of 97 sworn when we're at full capacity. We have the ability to be very familiar with who those officers are, and it causes us to do a deep dive and to see what's taking place. And if it warrants additional training, if it warrants discipline, those investigations are monitored by a captain level position in this department. And once they are reviewed at the captain's level, those are forwarded to the deputy chief of police, and then ultimately to me, to review that investigation, to really do a deep dive in to make sure that we've covered all of the steps that we've needed to cover during that investigation. And if we see a pattern of behavior, we will take appropriate corrective action to ensure it doesn't continue.
Next question. I would like to know what changes have been made by the Redwood City Police Department in the aftermath of the shooting of Kyle Hart. Less lethal force is definitely called in for police response to mental health incidents.
Yeah. So I want to. What happened with Mr. Hart was a very tragic situation. I feel badly for that family, and I want to be respectful of the family because we're at a pivotal time in our communications with them where we have some meetings that are coming up, and I want to make sure that I am respectful of those conversations that will take place in private with the family. So I will take the name out of it and speak generally for the time period. From that point, if we look at what we've done as an organization, we're moving forward with the implementation of body-worn cameras. It's not quite been on the timeline that we had hoped for, but our response to COVID-19 and the coronavirus has pretty much derailed any of the plans that we've had in place for moving things forward. We're also looking at buying we have purchased less lethal devices, less lethal launchers, 40 millimeter less lethal launchers that will go in all of the patrol cars. We're waiting for the delivery of those devices. We have a draft standalone de-escalation policy in place. We have a draft standalone crisis intervention policy that is in place, that is undergoing review. We've implemented additional crisis intervention training for the police department. We set a goal for 100% of our sworn members of the organization to achieve that training. We practice de-escalation training. We practice tactical communication training and adhere to those policies set forth by the state. So there's quite a few things that are being done and implemented organizationally. And again, but I do want to be respectful of the Hart family and understand that additional conversations will be taking place with them in the very near future.
Required de-escalation. How often do officers need to complete crisis intervention training?
So we have requirements that are dictated by the state, and I believe it is 4 hours every 2 years of combined tactical communication and crisis intervention training. The state does not mandate crisis intervention training. That is something that we decided after that initial block of instruction to add that to the 2-year rotation of tactical communication. So we're extending that 2-hour block of tactical communication to a 4-hour block of both tactical communication and de-escalation. And then we've also weaved in that 40-hour block with a goal of 100% of our employees receive, our sworn officers and sergeants to receive that crisis intervention training as part of a budgetary goal. We were on track to receiving that. We're in, I think, 90% of our officers and sergeants have received that training now. We were scheduled to have a much higher percentage during the current fiscal year, but several classes were canceled. That prevented our ability to do that. So we're looking forward to the resumption of that training in the next fiscal year to get us back on track. But it didn't just stop, the provision of that training didn't just stop with our sworn peace officers. We also included our professional support staff, our communication dispatchers. They're that first voice that is heard by members of the community that are calling in for assistance. And it's vitally important that they also have that training. This is not something that should just be limited to our police officers, because when our communication dispatchers are speaking with someone on the phone, they also need to have that same equally important measure of training. I set a goal for 100% of our communication dispatchers to receive that training. We're currently at 92%. Again, we would have been slightly higher if some of the training hadn't been canceled. We have additional blocks of instruction that will be offered later this year that will help them, or that will help those numbers that I've quoted you. We're currently at 90 and 92% for our personnel.
How many overall hours of training must an officer complete before they're allowed to patrol and to protect the community?
That is a lot. We have to send our police officers to the police academy. I believe that police academy is a 22-week long police academy. I believe the hour number is close to 800 hours or just over 700 hours. They then, upon successful completion, and I think the best analogy to use as you look at that, in order for an officer to become an effective police officer on the street, I look at it as building a house analogy. They go to the police academy and they get the foundational work that they need to develop to build that house. And that basic police academy, actually pulling up some notes that were sent to me to help me, that's 888 hours. It's a 16-week, a 22-week academy that we sent our police officers to. That gives them the foundation. Upon successful completion of the academy, they then transfer into a field training program that lasts about 18 weeks long. Now you're framing the house on the outside. So that's another 720, 750 hours. Trainees can be extended during that time depending upon their performance. And lateral police officers come in, that time can be reduced because they already have had much of that training. But if we're just looking at an entry-level police officer, we're framing that house now in the field training program. And then they're on a probationary period that extends beyond that. It could be up to 18 months for a probationary peace officer to further develop their skills. They've got the initial 6 months of training with the police academy and the field training program, then they've got another year after that. And we've parted ways with police officers in that probationary program. We've given every opportunity to succeed, but if they can't perform to the very high levels of the organization, they won't complete that probationary program. And I look at that probationary program as now you're finishing the interior of the house that you've built after sending that officer to the police academy. So those are the timelines, the sheer number of hours that are involved.
Can you specifically address what training the Redwood City Police Department provides to its staff to understand bias? What criteria does it apply to make sure that bias training meets the goals?
I'm very proud of the fact that while I've been in this position as a chief, we've found an innovative way to fund implicit bias training that was conducted at the police department. It was offered to all management level employees of the police department. That implicit bias training was also offered to the entire city of Redwood City management team. So we were able to host an instructor. We utilized asset forfeiture money, so it was at no cost to the general fund of the city of Redwood City. We found a cost-saving measure in order to provide that training. And all of our managers of the police department, all of our managers at the city level receive that implicit bias training. Now moving forward with the police department, we are on track for additional training to be offered in implicit bias to all of our police officers and professional support staff. That was scheduled to take place in April and May of this year. Unfortunately, with the restrictions on gatherings, we had to modify that training schedule, and that was pushed out a little bit later this year. So we'll have additional blocks of instruction in implicit bias to both the remainder of our sworn officer component as well as our professional staff. In addition, there's blocks of instruction that are offered by the police academy in cultural diversity. There's also in-service training that is offered. I believe it's do we have that information, John? Is it 2 hours? I believe it's 2 hours every 5 years. That sworn personnel are also required. But we're going above and beyond that by offering that additional implicit bias training to our personnel. But in addition to the academy, in addition to that in-service training, we're taking that very proactive step to offer that to all of our members of our organization.
Thank you, Chief. The next question is for City Manager. What would it take for the city to move funds away from policing and toward other community services that better address our problems?
Thank you for this question. We think carefully about the mix of services that we're able to provide whenever we create our annual budget. And as we look at the year ahead in particular, we have some work to do to match our revenues and our services. As we all know, we are entering into a recession period, and we are going to need to find some ways to reduce expenditures in the next several months. As Vice Mayor Mazur mentioned earlier, we'll be bringing a number of proposals to the City Council in October to better right size and match up our services with the revenues that we expect we're actually going to have this year. We're in the early stages of developing proposals for that. The feedback that we are receiving is helpful to us in thinking about those proposals going forward. And so both now and in the weeks ahead, we expect that we're going to have some different kinds of proposals in light of services needs, both related to policing as well as greater community needs that are coming forward and related to needs that are in our community as a result of the pandemic. So this is definitely a time of transition when we think about budgeting and we think about our mix of services. Thank you. Oh, sorry, I did want to also mention, Vice Mayor Mazur had mentioned at the beginning that we had posted a blog post yesterday trying to dispel some misunderstandings regarding next year's budget. That's available on our city website. And so if you go to redwoodcity.org, it's in the news section. We also encourage you to sign up for some of our electronic newsletters because we'd love to be able to share updates with you going forward. Thanks.
Next, I'm going to ask the mayor. Will you, Mayor Howard, commit to reforms through changes in funding, such as no purchases of military-grade equipment for the department, the hiring of social workers and mental health professionals to respond to calls in which they could better serve citizens of Redwood City than police officers, and additional diversion of funds from police to social and mental health services?
Thank you for the question. I am committed to listening to the community, to working with our community partners, and to find better approaches in working with our staff and community members to see if there are changes that are necessary and changes that need to be made. We're a mid-sized city, so we don't directly employ mental health professionals or directly fund education, but we do and will continue to work closely with these agencies and the organizations that do handle mental health and education. We'll examine what roles they may be willing to take in working with our police department. We understand many residents don't want to feel that they are being heavily policed, and I know that the chief has thoughts about the equipment we use and how we engage with the community. But I wanted to mention two things. That today I was on the phone call with Congresswoman Jackie Spear. She mentioned the George Floyd Policing Act, which is moving through Congress and will be addressing weapons as well as policing policies. And we will be watching that legislation very closely to see what adjustments we need to make. The chief also mentioned that in the state, there's legislation discussing different tactics and policies. Again, the chief has assured us he's going to be paying particular attention to all the legislation and see what it needs and what we need to do to adjust. So I wanted to ask the chief if he would like to add at this point anything about equipment, tests or vests, or anything he would like to add to my answer. Chief Mulholland?
Thank you, Mayor. So the term military grade, it's interesting that can mean very many things. I mean, we have boots that we wear that are military grade. We have flashlights. We have communication equipment. We do not receive firearms from the federal government as part of any kind of reallocation of military resources. But there are certain quality control levels that firearms need to achieve. So they might be military grade for us just to carry our service sidearm. So if we go by that term of military grade, that could impact the type of firearm we carry because those firearms are military grade. It doesn't mean we receive them from the military. Ballistic helmets that our personnel wear if they are confronted with a much greater threat. Kevlar vests that might be that are worn by our personnel, or external ballistic vests that are worn by our personnel in extreme situations. Those are all military grade. So I don't think the question is more on the actual military grading. I think it's probably more focusing on the vehicle that we had and that we have in our inventory. And I understand that we received that again directly from the military. That is something that we are considering as a police department. Really looking at is that the best piece of equipment that we can have in our inventory. Again, I mentioned the fact that it is an insurance policy. It provides a use, but does it provide the best use? And that is something that we're looking at now. So we're taking a close look at that vehicle, but those other items, as far as military grade goes, even something as fairly routine as the external vest carriers that our officers carry. I was very concerned about our appearance of our personnel when we transitioned to an external vest carrier that put some of the equipment on the outside. A committee was convened. We looked at various options. We wanted to make sure that a type of fabric, a type of material, a type of shirt that would be worn under that external garment was very consistent with what we currently wear, what you see here in the video of the uniform that I am wearing. But there's very good reason for us implementing that external vest carrier program. You see some of our officers that are wearing it. Most of our officers have it. And that was to reduce lower back injuries to our personnel because they have such a heavy load of equipment that are on their belts. By utilizing that piece of equipment that took the strain off of their waistline and transferred it up to their shoulders. So if we had a slider officer that didn't have room on their belt to carry all those pieces of equipment, they could then transfer to the external vest carrier that would allow them a means to carry that additional protective equipment that they need when they're performing their duties, and also as really a health measure to preserve the longevity of the men and women working for this organization. I can tell you, after doing this job for more than 3 decades, I've got a back problem, and I never had the opportunity of wearing those vests that our officers in the field now wear. But I wanted to make I wanted to be absolutely sure that what we would be deploying in the field very closely matched what we wore as a traditional police uniform, and not a militaristic vest that you might see perhaps worn by a tactical team. So those are some steps that we are taking, things that we have done to project an image of a demilitarized police department, and one that focuses on serving our community in a more traditional way.
Thank you, Chief. Noting the time, I would now like to ask our city clerk to please begin the public comment portion. So I will hand it over to our city clerk.
Thank you, Jennifer. Good evening, members of the public. I'm going to read the public comment that was sent to our public comment email box that are related to tonight's agenda topic. The first one is from Michael Chappell, and it reads, "Good evening. I want to thank the esteemed members of the Redwood City Council and Police Chief Dan Mulholland for hosting tonight's town hall meeting. As a white American, the past 2 weeks have been an eye-opening and learning experience about the many injustices and racism that our fellow neighbors and countrymen experience every day. I very much appreciated Police Chief Mulholland's statement on the Redwood City Police Department's use of force and training policies. The Redwood City Police Force has already implemented many reforms, de-escalation training, duty to intervene, and the banning of chokeholds are incredibly important policies that the department has already implemented. Nevertheless, one issue that has become apparent these past 2 weeks is the militarization of U.S. police forces. The Redwood City Police Department must commit to give back or destroy any tactical military equipment it has received or purchased, as well as stop participation in any militarization exercises or programs. Military weapons, equipment, and training do not make our community nor our neighbors safer. Too often they will escalate situations unnecessarily. Further, the Redwood City Police Department must commit not to hire officers that have used excessive force while working for other police departments. Too often, negligent officers will attempt to move to another police department when they are accused of excessive force and we do not need these individuals working in our community. Thank you for your time.
Okay, a lot to unpack on that one, so I'll move quickly through it, starting with the, am I supposed to respond to this? Let me just clarify. Is this a public comment or are you seeking a response from me?
This is public comment.
Okay.
I'm trying to get to my other screen. Just a quick second. Okay, the next public comment is a letter from the Mid-Peninsula ACLU, and it reads, "Good evening, Chief Mulholland and City Council. Redwood City is one of the cities in the Mid-Peninsula ACLU chapters region. We want to begin a continuing dialogue about Redwood City's police practices in light of the national concern about police brutality. Since tonight's meeting centers around training and use of force policies, we will address 3 concerns. These 3 points are, number 1, training related to racial profiling. Your police department policies and training website states, racial profiling. This training provides officers with an understanding of what racial profiling is and the negative impact it can have not only on the individual, but the entire community. Officers learn how racial profiling or bias-based policing compromises the public trust. Redwood City Police Department officers attend 2 hours of training every 5 years. This time would average out to less than 30 seconds per month. The importance of this issue cannot be overstated. We suggest serious research and outreach begin on what other police departments do to make their officers aware of the history of racial issues from the beginning of slavery through Jim Crow laws to the current school to prison pipeline. Number 2, police transparency. Filing a formal complaint against a department employee, the website states, you may file an internal affairs complaint in person by printing and completing an internal affairs intake form, which can be obtained here. The completed form must be signed and your contact phone number must be listed in order for the complaint to be investigated. Our concern is that many people would never do that because they so trust time. And we have one last comment, and this is from Hannah Gaek. I have lived in Redwood City for nearly 8 years now. I just bought a home here and have given birth to and began to raise both of my children here. My children will both attend public school here, and my son will receive disability services due to his autism spectrum disorder. I have always been proud of this community, and I desperately want to continue to be proud of it. I call on Chief Mulholland and our public officials to restructure the police department, to decrease its budget, and reallocate the funds to public services, including the creation of Redwood City's own mental health services department, which should exist. It is time to make sure that 100% of the police department receives crisis intervention training, and that all officers coming into contact with the public for any reason be required to wear body cameras. Since the police department budget has been continually increased, budgetary restraints are not an acceptable excuse for the training to not be completed or for body cameras not to be available. We have an amazing opportunity right now to change things for the better. Let's not waste it. And that is the written public comment that we have received.
Thank you, Ms. Aguilar. I see we have several phone call-in listeners, and I'll call them, and I'll mention 2 names at a time, and you'll have 2 minutes to speak. My first speaker is Desmond Frazier.
Hello.
Mr. Frazier?
Yes, can everyone hear me?
Yes.
Cool. All right, so I am bringing it up because I can't be the only one that feels this way, but it appears that the purpose of this dialogue is to provide the community with perfect answers to these questions rather than listening. I want to emphasize that we aren't looking for sexy answers, and we're really here to feel heard, seen, and valued, and I haven't felt that energy just yet. We're living in a time where everyone is searching for answers, but instead of beginning with the answers I may have, I wanted to pose a question, and that is, what side of history do you want to be on? When they're writing about this time that we're in the next 15, 20, 25 years, what will you tell your kids and grandkids you were doing? Where were you? I challenge everyone here today to take the time and think of the time that we're actually in today. Middle of a pandemic, a civil war, and some would call it a race war against the systems, breaking out against the systems that of this country that weren't designed to surface people who look like me. I want to be clear that these controversial issues are not going anywhere anytime soon if we do not heal these wounds and take that time that is necessary. Now is the time for the care to be ascertained and we do not need me. Oh, okay. And we do not need Band-Aid solutions, for we'll face the repercussions of that decision in the long term. I ask all of you that are in power that with every decision and every stroke of a pen and every breath, that you listen to the voices that are here today and beyond. Cool.
Thank you, Mr. Frazier. That was well said. Myra Soto and then Dario McCarty.
Hello, can you hear me?
Yes, I can.
Perfect. So I wanted to add to the ACLU statement. So in 2018 and 2019, I was a volunteer at our both local high schools as a mentor for youth. And one of their primary concerns is being pulled over and harassed by police officers. I do want to say that I'm a lifelong resident of Redwood City. And I've also experienced that in my younger years. And it makes me very sad and angry to know that this is still happening in Redwood City. So I'm part of the Latino community. And most of my youth that I mentored, I do want to add that I'm also a social worker. So most of the youth that I mentored are from these Latino communities. And Most of their parents are afraid to make those reports because they don't know what the consequences of that is. So yes, Redwood City Department might be doing a lot of things for the community, but how can we improve the trust of the youth who live here and of the parents when they're being pulled over for ridiculous excuses? So that is my question. How can we improve their trust?
That's a good question. Our next speaker is Dario McCarty and then Don Shoecraft.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yes, I can.
Hello?
Yes, I can hear you, Dario.
So-
There's a bit of an echo.
Okay, yeah, sorry. That should be good now, but I just wanted to say, get up here, I've been a long time resident of Redwood City, and quite frankly, after seeing what is probably the biggest protest maybe that I've seen in Redwood City, and then to learn that after we are now increasing the budget to our police department and cutting the budget for parks and recreation and community services is absolutely disingenuous and enraging. It's disgusting for you guys to get up there and act like you're our friends and you're listening to us and you're talking about how you're trying to make us be heard. Well, we're speaking loud and clear, and you are clearly not listening to us. Okay, and this idea that we're gonna increase the police budget and that's gonna somehow fix things. Well, at a time when we have people who are literally living paycheck to paycheck, and at a time when our community is hit by coronavirus, the fact that we are increasing with everything that's going on in the world right now, and the fact that we have just had this massive protest about the problems that we are experiencing, that your response is to increase the police budget, quite frankly, it's abhorrent. I'm ashamed. I think you guys should be ashamed of yourselves. And right now, I'm ashamed to be a part of this community. The fact that is what we're doing. That is our response. And I just want to remind you guys that 4 of you guys on the city council are up for re-election, and you are all elected officials, and you think that you can get away with raising the budget when because nobody ever pays attention to city politics. But we are all paying attention right now, and I will make sure every single one of my friends vote. I will make sure every single one of them vote if we are not heard. So that's all I really want to say.
There we go. I'm sorry. Dario, I did want to mention that I think we said earlier that we are not cutting park recreation and community services. It's coming later in the fall, and it will be addressed then, and it is not being cut. And we're spending $9 million in affordable housing. I just wanted to clarify that, but thank you for your comments, and believe me, we are listening. Don Shoecraft and then Ben Packer. Don, can you unmute yourself? Mr. Shoecraft?
Yes, thank you.
There we go.
Oh, we're
Hi.
here. Well, thank you, Madam Mayor, and thank you, Chief. My question had to do with how often that police officers in Redwood City have been disciplined for excessive use of force. And if you would share, as the eight Can't Wait campaign required, if you would participate in the 8 Can't Wait campaign to establish a national database of bad actors.
I'd like to ask our city manager, the questions were being given. I want to have people have time to get their questions out. Will we be publishing answers to these questions? There's some excellent questions being proposed, but we are running out of time. So should we take the questions and then post the answers on our website and
Yes, thank you. Yes, so there were a number of questions that were received in advance that we were not able to address tonight. All of those will be answered on the website. Additionally, a number of questions came in through Q&A during the course of the meeting. Those will be addressed as well too. So we have this fine line of trying to balance, trying to have some level of dialogue here, knowing there's a huge interest. So we'll take as at least one next step, providing that information online after the meeting. Given the number of questions, I would say it will probably take a few days. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Ms. Diaz, and recognizing we are going to have additional forums because there is so much we need to hear, and tonight was just not enough time, so we will have future town hall meetings in regards to this topic. Mr. Smith, Michael Smith, I believe you're next, and Ben Packer, did he speak?
This is Ben, I'm here.
Ben Packer?
Yep. Hi, good evening.
Thank you.
I'll keep my comment brief. I'll just reiterate some of what I said at City Council on Monday night. We proclaimed our support for Black Lives Matter, and I hope that the city uses this opportunity to take real and meaningful action. I support the recommendations in Desmond Fraser's letter to you. This includes action on the budget and diverting resources to community services, but also includes establishing the Citizens Advisory Committee, increasing transparency for officer personal complaint records, and conducting a clear audit of police policy. So please listen to the voices of our Black community and our communities of color and enact meaningful change. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Packer. We'll take two more speakers, and then if you would like to submit your questions, we will provide answers on our website, and we're going to have additional town halls, as I said. So Michael Smith would be next, and then Adrian Brandt.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yes, I can, Michael.
Okay, great. So the recent deaths of George Floyd and Breonna Taylor at the hands of law enforcement have sharpened the perspective on the need for our country and communities to change. Coming on the heels of the Corona-19 virus, it's very clear that every US community must begin to ask themselves difficult questions. Questions around equality, race, and policing. Redwood City must not abdicate its role in this national discussion and collective inflection point, since it is a community that manages a policing agency that quite literally holds the lives of its residents in its hands. At its core, I believe that this is a moment we are experiencing is about building bridges. Bridges between city staff and neighborhoods, and bridges between vulnerable communities and our police department. I also believe that the bridge building process begins with meaningful and action-oriented conversation among community members and leadership. As a planning commissioner, neighborhood co-chair, and a member of the Black community in Redwood City, I would like to articulate my full support for the active consideration of the recommendations that Des Fraser and the Black Lives Matter organizers have proposed in their policing memo sent to the Redwood City leadership with a call to action. As the memo astutely indicates, there are at least 2 recommendations that are easily implementable. Subsequent to those recommendations, we must formalize and forecast a process to address the remaining recommendations. As I mentioned during my words during the BLM protest last week, based on my own experience providing recommendations at the city level, I believe the Redwood City leadership is open to dialogue and interested in innovating to serve our community better. I hope that this moment in our collective history will be remembered at as a time when our city and police department seize the opportunity to pursue innovative strategies and policy for betterment of our community. The COVID-19 crisis that we are still managing presents a stark contrast in how we explore matters that we are discussing tonight. When the city leaders were confronted with this urgent matter of COVID-19, swift and decisive action was taken, understanding the situation. As a Black man in our country, I see comprehensive policing reform in the same way. It is a matter that we must address with intention and urgency to ensure the health and safety for all.
Thank you, Mr. Smith. I appreciate your comments. Adrian Brandt.
Okay, there we go. I didn't have the unmute button. Hello, good evening. I wanted to comment on body-worn cams. It is well-known, long-established fact that they're extremely effective in both protecting citizens and the police department and the taxpayers who have to pay for any legal costs stemming from complaints or disputes or anything of that nature. And yet, Redwood City, to my knowledge, is among the last, if not the last, police agency on the peninsula to adopt body-worn cams. So given that some comments made before, I don't think that we can rest on the budget as an excuse much longer in light of what's happened. I think it's just long overdue that we have those. So I'd like to have answered, and I did make it in the Q&A, I wrote this question, but what is the rollout plan, for Redwood City? And will the police department also commit to making camera footage of any major incident public for full transparency? And the other aspect of it is, will the department ensure that officers involved in any formal complaint or major use of force incident are at least initially debriefed or interviewed before they're able to review body cam recordings, just to ensure, because this is actually happening, that this does not affect or influence their account of the incident to match what the cameras did or did not capture. So those are my concerns on that point. Thanks.
Thank you, Mr. Brandt. And I know the police chief will be addressing those concerns because we are going to be answering those questions, but thank you for bringing that up. I'm really sorry that we aren't able to keep going and answering everyone's questions tonight, but I wanted to say that we had about 500 people come and share the screen here and listen to the town hall. It's been a little bit of a challenge, what with Zoom and distancing policies and everything that we are working, all the challenges we're working with. So it's not a perfect system, but it's a start. And I wanted to thank our city staff because they've been here all day long trying to make sure that everything runs smoothly for us. We're going to take everyone who has their hand up on the board over here and everyone who had written in questions under the chat, as well as the questions that will continue to come in. And we are going to be answering all of those questions, I promise you. And we are going to have future town hall meetings. I wanted to say right now that this council promises you that we're going to continue this discussion, but not only continue the discussion, we are going to be listening, but we are committed to look at possibility for change. That's what you're asking of us. You're asking us to look at things a little bit differently and to examine how we do the business of our city. And that's what we're going to do. I promise you that. It's for the health and safety of everyone in this community that we do it and that we do it now. With the death of George Floyd, it's impacted each and every one of us in different ways. But I can tell you, we are going to pull together as a community, as Redwood City always has, and we are going to look at the changes we can make for now and into the future. But we need your help, and we do need your participation. This was a little bit structured tonight, maybe a little uncomfortable for some, but we're going to learn from tonight and see how we can keep doing it better, because we do want to hear your thoughts and concerns, believe me. So I wanted to say thank you all for being part of this. I really, really appreciate it. I want you all, you and your families, to stay healthy and safe. And we're going to adjourn this evening. Again, stay healthy and safe. Good night.